Hello and welcome to Natasha Explains It All. Today's episode is going to be another from my new series called Book Report, where I share book recommendations that hopefully resonate with you and can give you an idea if you're looking for a good read or a good audio book experience. Like a prior recommendation in my book report, today's is also a memoir. It's called Leaving Isn't the Hardest Thing by Lauren Hough. And like the prior memoir that I covered, this one I also listened to as an audiobook and found it a really rich experience because the author reads it. Lauren Hough reads it. She actually alternates between herself and then the actress Kate Blanchett. And they alternate in the sense that, or the way that they divide up their parts is that leaving isn't the hardest thing is actually a series of essays, and so they take different essays to read. But the common thread is talking about Lauren's life. It's a memoir, and it is a gripping read or her audio experience because Lauren has had such a intense, complicated, um, uh, rich life. I'm not quite sure what is the right adjective for it. She talks about such a diversity of experiences that may be things that you are curious about or things that you never thought you would be curious about, but now that you're listening to it, you find, fascinating and disturbing and also educational, and also quite a deep reflection on American life and um, the myth of the American dream and the threadbare social safety net that exists in the United States and the struggle that it is to survive in a highly capitalist society that is the United States. And she speaks very honestly and uh, and eloquently about that. And her experiences range from, she covers her time growing up in a cult with her parents and then escaping the cult and the ramifications that has had for her life to this day. She talks about what it's like to be in the military and particularly what it's like to be a lesbian in the military. And she talks about an episode where, as often happens with people who are the victims of hate crimes, she was the victim of a hate crime while in the military because because of her sexual orientation, and yet she was the one who was punished as a result of that for being the victim, and she ended up being court-martialed for it, which is like the military's internal judicial process, and lost out on an assignment and other details that she goes into. She talks about what it's like to go to jail. She talks about what it's like to be the cable guy. Um, she talks about what it's like to be a bouncer. She talks about what it's like to be homeless. And she's lived all over as well. She's lived in the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. She's lived in many other places in the country. She's lived abroad in many places because the cult that she was part of um, was based in many different places. She was actually born in Germany and then made her way to the United States at a later point. Um, and so this, they are experiences that are often not captured in literature. And Lauren is a relatively young person. These are very recent experiences. I'm not sure exactly how old she is, um, um, but um, but all of these experiences happened within the last few decades, and the just the richness of them, and the the vulnerability with which she tells her story is quite taking and makes it while there are certain parts that can be really, really hard to process, um, it's just said so honestly, and so simply at the same time, that you just want to keep going. And I mentioned earlier that one common thread throughout her book, "Leaving Isn't the Hardest Thing," is growing up in this cult and then leaving the cult and then dealing with the PTSD and the struggle evermore to develop healthy relationships with other people because the cult environment was so exploitative in every sense of the word, physically, sexually, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. And, she was able to get out, but the effects of that traumatic experience continue to linger. And she really gives the reader insight into exactly how that manifests. And as I was reading those parts, it really reminded me of some former clients of mine. For a time, I represented juveniles in the DC juvenile justice system. It's very unjust. Um, and oftentimes, my clients had diagnoses that to me seemed like an attempt to, you know, make them appear, I don't know, mentally ill when, or, something quite wrong with them, when actually all that was really happening uh, was their response to massive trauma and the manifestation of their survival instincts being now pathologized. And what I mean by that specifically is, you know, anyone who has experienced PTSD, whether it's in because of a war setting or because you live in like, a very violent neighborhood, or you've left a cult, or you've left an abusive relationship, there when you were in that traumatic setting, you develop certain skills, certain survival skills, to be able to survive. It's actually quite an intelligent thing, right? Is the body's desire to survive, and it adapts. However, once you leave that traumatic environment, and go to a different environment where the same dangers are not present, it takes time, right, to be able to transition and to unlearn those survival skills. And the mismatch between your skill set and the new environment can cause real serious issues and your behavior to be seen as, antisocial, when really all it is that you are struggling to adapt to a new environment where you don't have the same triggers and you don't have the same threat to your survival present. And in the case of my clients, I saw this a lot in the school context that, I think about one example in particular. I had a client who had just experienced massive amounts of trauma in his young life, including being incarcerated many times for long periods, including, having um, his father being shot to death when he was young, and at many, many other forms of very serious trauma. And being incarcerated, one of the things that form of trauma can make someone very hyper vigilant. And that is a survival instinct so that you don't get jumped, or, otherwise hurt while you're incarcerated. Same thing for the type of neighborhoods that he grew up in, etc. But in the school context, that didn't translate well, right? The hypervigilance was could lead to fights very easily, and it was seen as antisocial. And he was actually diagnosed with something called emotional disturbance, which I hadn't even heard of before then. And again, I'm not a doctor, so take what I'm saying with a grain of salt, but I really felt that his diagnosis of emotional disturbance was, I mean, really, they were just trying to put a diagnosis to the fact that this young person had serious PTSD, and was simply having a mismatch, right, between his survival skills, which are a sign of deep intelligence in being able to adapt to incredibly unstable environments, and that those skills did not translate into the school setting. And as a result, he continued to get in trouble. And, the resources were not provided to him for him to be able to adapt and to actually feel safe and supported in the school environment. And so he kept getting kicked out of schools. Just a kind of a classic example of school to prison pipeline. And anyway, Lauren's story is not a school to prison pipeline story, but it is very much, it reminded me of this phenomenon of when someone has experienced a lot of trauma and has developed survival skills and coping mechanisms to be able to endure that traumatic situation, which is a sign of resilience and is a sign of strength and is actually something that should be, um, you know, like applauded and acknowledged and being like, wow, you are so resilient. You have so much grit to be able to get out of that situation and still be alive. Um, and instead, like really being punished for that and not getting the help that she needed, and how it's continuing to um, play out in her relationships, and particularly her, to what extent she can connect and form like meaningful relationships with other people. And part of it is all of the stuff that I was talking about the impacts of PTSD, but also part of it as well, which I guess could be tied to PTSD. I'm not a therapist or a doctor. There's also just this level of like, to what extent can other people truly understand what I've been through? And to what extent will I be judged? And I fear, sharing truly truly who I am because I'm afraid, right, of what could come from that. And so she talks about, you know, hiding the fact that she grew up in a cult from people, and just the fear that she had about what would happen if that came to light. And that, yeah, just really reminded me of experiences of working with um, incarcerated clients and formerly incarcerated clients. Um, And I mean, she also talks about her experience of being incarcerated, and it's just very representative of just how disgusting, and so not pro public safety, despite all of the propaganda about why we need a carceral system as large as it is. Anyway, so I highly recommend this series of essays. Again, such a uh, diverse group of subject matters, told in a really compelling way, and um, is a very personal critique of society and what we could be doing better to support each other, so that we can be healthier, and we can be happier society. So yeah, it was just really, really great read. Leaving Isn't the Hardest Thing by Lauren Hough. I highly recommend. And I will include in the show notes not only links to where you can purchase the book, um, from independent booksellers, of course, but also Lauren did several interviews related to her book. Um, and so I highly recommend also YouTubing her book, and listening to some of the interviews, for further insight into this author and her experiences and what we can learn from them. So, anyway, with that, I'm going to close. Thanks so much for listening. And I hope that if you do read Leaving Isn't the Hardest Thing, that you'll leave a comment. You can leave a voicemail for me on Spotify. Let me know what you thought. I'm interested in hearing from listeners. All right, with that, I'm going to close. Thanks so much and see you next time.